the General Assembly can play in the prevention of atrocity crimes. And today we're very happy to launch this guidance document, which addresses these important themes. And it's my honor, again, to co-host this event with the not only the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, but the Asia Pacific Center, and with the governments of Australia and the permanent missions, I should say, of Australia and Croatia. So it's now my honor to give the floor to the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency, Mr. Volkan Bozkir, for some opening remarks via video message.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to speak at the launch of the report entitled The Powers of the UN General Assembly to Prevent and Respond to Atrocity Crimes, a guidance document. I take note of this report and the recommendations contained within. The Responsibility to Protect agenda attempts to advance arguably the most critical area on the United Nations agenda. It seeks to narrow the gap between member states' pre-existing obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law, which have existed since the creation of the United Nations, and the current reality where people are at risk of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. The General Assembly has taken action to advance this agenda, including the convention of annual informal interactive dialogues to discuss the findings and recommendations of the Secretary General's report. The General Assembly continues to call for state compliance to prevent and punish atrocity crimes and bring situations of concern to the attention of the Security Council. I welcome the adoption on 17th of May 2021 of the resolution under the agenda item on the responsibility to protect to include the item in its annual agenda and request the Secretary General to report to it every year on the issue. However, it is clear from past and current atrocity crimes that there can be done, and more can be done. Millions are still at risk, and the COVID-19 pandemic has only made the situation more perilous, more exacerbating existing vulnerabilities and creating new protection challenges around the world. We have witnessed a surge in stigmatization and hate speech. We have seen the increase in incitement and violence towards national, ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities. We have watched people being targeted simply because of their identity. State and non-state actors continue to flagrantly disregard well-established principles of international human rights and humanitarian law. These states are failing to protect their people, and in some cases are at the front and center of persecutions. The long-term societal effects of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity cannot be emphasized enough. Last week, I visited Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where 1 million Rohingya Muslims have fled and taken refuge from the most unspeakable crimes. The pain was raw, the devastation visible on the faces of men and women who, like parents everywhere, just want the best for their children. The RTP principles that are being discussed today matter and must be taken forward. I strongly urge member states to, firstly, further support and prioritize atrocity prevention at the national, regional, and international levels, including in partnership with the Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. Secondly, allocate dedicated capacities and resources to atrocity prevention assessment and response. And finally, to provide continuing support to United Nations efforts to prevent atrocity crimes, including to the provision of technical assistance to help all states to uphold their responsibility to protect populations. Advancing the protection agenda requires trust and cohesion among member states and regional and international organizations. On the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, I encourage you all to take further steps to make this most basic human right a reality. I thank you.
I thank the President of the General Assembly for those welcoming words. And I would now like to give the floor to our co-host and dear friend, His Excellency, Mr. Ivan Simonovic, Permanent Representative of Croatia to the United Nations, for some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Simon. Dear colleagues, we heard the President of General Assembly's powerful message. Around the world, atrocity crimes are on the rise. They are being committed with devastating effect, and in many cases, seemingly with impunity. The United Nations seem unable neither to prevent such crimes nor to adequately respond to them when they occur. Atrocity crimes prevention is the core UN business. In 1945, the Charter of the United Nations was adopted to, and I quote, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, and establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from international law can be maintained. More recently, the UN General Assembly in 2005 consensually agreed that the international community, through the United Nations, has the responsibility to use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. But what is the reality? Why are we facing the rise of atrocity crimes? The UN Security Council, which according to the Charter has primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, is in many cases unable to effectively prevent atrocity crimes due to divisions, especially amongst its permanent members. At the end, it is civilians caught up in conflict and the victims of atrocity crimes everywhere who are paying the price. It is therefore timely for the UN member states to explore the various ways in which the UN General Assembly can more effectively utilize its own powers to prevent atrocity crimes and respond to them when they occur. The General Assembly does not have powers of the Security Council. It cannot pass legally binding resolutions, nor does it have the power to enforce its recommendations. The General Assembly has, however, its own strengths. It is the only fully representative organ within the UN system. It is explicitly empowered by the UN Charter to make recommendations relating to human rights and on matters of international peace and security. And most importantly, its decisions are not subject to the veto power. This guidance document on the legal options available to the UN General Assembly to prevent and respond to atrocity crimes is therefore very timely and relevant. It provides a much needed resource regarding what the General Assembly can do based on the UN Charter and other sources of international law, as well as the Assembly's own established practice. Some of the interpretations of the General Assembly's powers that are described in this guide are controversial. However, the guidance document describes what could be done, not what should be done. It provides political decision makers and diplomats with a menu of available legal options, leaving to them to decide which options to use in any particular case. I sincerely hope this guidance document will inspire member states to give renewed attention to the powers of the General Assembly to prevent and respond to atrocity crimes. It should moreover significantly assist legal advisors in the ministries of foreign affairs and permanent missions to the UN in New York to advise decision makers on available options. As mentioned by the President, the recently adopted General Assembly resolution, putting responsibility to protect permanently on its agenda and requesting the Secretary General to annually report, will significantly increase the opportunities for all member states to contribute to better prevention of atrocity crimes. These reports and debates should be used not only to discuss various aspects of responsibility to protect, but also how to implement it on country situations, learning from our successes as well as failures. None of these means giving up on the Security Council. To the contrary, engagement of the General Assembly in matters of international peace and security, as well as providing additional opportunities for all member states to assess the Security Council's performance, can only help it to fulfill its mandate and serve the global community. And above all, to improve the UN's synergy to prevent populations from suffering the devastating effects of atrocity crimes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's always an honor to have your support. We are also delighted to be joined today by a distinguished panel for this launch, and I'd like to welcome in that context Karen Smith, the UN Special Advisor on the Responsibility to Protect, and Rebecca Barber, the Research Fellow at the Asia Pacific Center for the Responsibility to Protect, and who is author of this guidance document that we're all here to launch and talk about today. It's a pleasure to have you both with us. I'll be posing some questions to each of you, and we'll jump in from time to time to intervene, I guess, and provide my own reflections. And time permitting, we'll also try to take some questions from the audience if we can towards the end. So let me maybe start with you, Rebecca. People describe the UN General Assembly as the world's parliament, but I think it would be fair to say it's a pretty misunderstood institution. And I think your report also argues that it's a underutilized tool when it comes to the prevention of atrocities in the world. So how?
Yeah, thanks so much, Simon. Just before I start, I would have myself express my very sincere gratitude to the Australian and Croatian permanent missions for their support for this event, and more importantly, for their support for this issue more broadly. It's been incredibly encouraging to see the level of support for the general notion of the General Assembly taking a stronger role in preventing mass atrocities. In response to the question about the General Assembly being a misunderstood institution, it's very well known that in the international security system, the Security Council has primary responsibility for international peace and security. And it's also very well known that there are certain very important things that only the Security Council can do. It's only the Security Council that can impose binding legal obligations on states, for example, such as by imposing mandatory arms embargoes. And it's only the Security Council that can refer matters to the International Criminal Court and various other things that only the Security Council can do. But in my experience in advocacy with NGOs and engaging with states in that capacity, the powers of the General Assembly are not as widely understood as those of the Security Council. The International Court of Justice has said very explicitly that the responsibility of the Security Council for international peace and security is primary, not exclusive, and that the General Assembly has a secondary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. But this secondary responsibility of the General Assembly for international peace and security tends to be overlooked. It's also sometimes overlooked that while the Security Council has primary responsibility for international peace and security, in the framework of the UN Charter, it's the General Assembly that has primary responsibility for human rights. Atrocity crimes unquestionably threaten international peace and security, and so the Security Council should, of course, take action to prevent them. but atrocity crimes are also first and foremost human rights violations. So the prevention of atrocity crimes unquestionably falls within the purview of the General Assembly, both because of its primary responsibility for human rights and because of its secondary responsibility for international peace and security. The second thing that I would say is that there is sometimes a tendency to regard the limitations on the General Assembly's powers as more significant than they in fact are. The most significant limitation on the General Assembly's powers is that its recommendations are not binding. But no one would disagree that they carry substantial political weight, and there are many things that the General Assembly can do without needing to create binding legal obligations. These include recommending sanctions, establishing commissions of inquiry, making recommendations to the Security Council, or requesting reports from the Security Council. They're all described in more detail in the guidance document. There are other limitations on the General Assembly's powers. It can't make recommendations on a matter right at the same time as the Security Council is also acting on the same matter, and any question on which action is necessary must be referred to the Security Council. But the International Court of Justice has made it very clear that both of these restrictions are to be interpreted narrowly. These restrictions don't prevent the General Assembly from utilising any of the tools that are described in the guidance document. The final thing I would say in relation to the General Assembly as an institution being misunderstood is that while the General Assembly's powers are now quite clear, because they've been interpreted by the International Court of Justice in a series of cases and affirmed over several decades in the General Assembly's own practice, the terms of the Charter itself are open to different interpretations. So the General Assembly's powers have over the years been the subject of significant debate, both academic and political. So what inspired the development of this guidance document was the sense that to some extent the specifics of what the General Assembly can do to prevent atrocity crimes and the full range of options available to it is buried in books and academic journals and decisions of the International Court of Justice and of course the General Assembly's own past resolutions, and that this doesn't make it particularly easy for diplomats and their advisors to have all of the various options at their fingertips when resolutions are being drafted. So the guidance document is to some extent an attempt to push all of the tools that are available to the General Assembly to the forefront of political debate and to help encourage a culture shift in the General Assembly towards a situation in which when atrocity crimes are being committed and the Security Council isn't responding, the General Assembly gives more serious attention to what it can concretely do to respond.
Thanks for that, Rebecca. Apologize, there's a bit of a New York soundtrack going on in the back here. This is that you can tell I'm coming live to you from Brooklyn. But no, I agree. I mean, one of the things I think that's great about this document is, for example, from my own personal interest point of view, I was aware that the South African apartheid regime couldn't get its diplomats credentialed, during the 1980s. But where do you find out that information, and where do you find out the kind of the legal basis of it and how it all played out and what was decided? Well, it's all here in this guidance document and many other goodies as well. So I think the fact that you've kind of not just compiled that, but constructed all the legal arguments for and against is incredibly useful. Karen, do you agree that there is political space for the UN General Assembly to play a more central role in confronting and hopefully preventing atrocities in the world?
Thanks, Simon. And yeah, before I answer, obviously my answer is going to be yes, but I will elaborate. But before that, I just want to congratulate Rebecca for producing this fantastic report, and of course also for the assistance of the Asia Pacific Center on R2P, the Global Center on R2P, and of course also, as has already been pointed out, the missions of Australia and Croatia to the UN. And I just wanted to also pick up on what Rebecca has just said. I think it's so important. I was just attending an academic conference on R2P over the last 2 days. And, academics are doing such fantastic work on all kinds of elements of the implementation and the conceptual questions around the responsibility to protect and related issues. And, I kept kind of trying to encourage them to say, please also, besides publishing academic papers, try to, turn some of your work into kind of more accessible, policy relevant documents that are accessible to policymakers. Because exactly as Rebecca has said, I think all this information, or much of it, is out there. But to be able to have it in this format where it's all been kind of collated in a way that really is fantastic and very useful, I think is really great. So again, just congratulations to Rebecca for doing that. So getting to your question, Simon, I think absolutely. I mean, I very much agree that there's considerable political space for the General Assembly to utilize its so-called secondary responsibility for international peace and security, and play a more robust and I think also a constructive role in preventing and responding to atrocity crimes. Not least because it is the main deliberative and the only representative organ of the United Nations, but also because it has a broad mandate that encompasses human rights, as Rebecca has underlined, but also humanitarian, social, and economic issues. And this then allows it to understand and engage with atrocity crimes and their prevention in a broader context beyond peace and security. And also, of course, in a more general sense, I think, the General Assembly, despite its shortcomings, it is seen as representing world opinion. And so its pronouncements on issues of concern are taken seriously. And as Rebecca just noted, carry political weight. And it's taken seriously not just by the world at large, but it's also relied on by, for example, the ICJ and the ICC in their judgments, further reflecting its perceived authority. Now, maybe just Rebecca reflected on some of the possible kind of constraints on the General Assembly. And I think also, we have to admit the fact that with 193 members, this potentially makes deliberations and reaching agreement quite cumbersome. But it also means on the positive side that all states can participate in decision-making equally. And I think this really should be an opportunity seized upon by especially those who are critical of the Security Council and its limitations. But in line with Ambassador Simonovic's opening remarks, I also want to emphasize that this does not mean that the General Assembly should in any way supplant the work of the Security Council or in fact of regional organizations either. I think the emphasis should be on promoting complementarity of the General Assembly in matters of international peace and security. So that's my quick answer to that. Thanks.
No, thanks, Karen. And yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point. And I think maybe to go back to you, Rebecca, and following on from what Karen just said, many of the General Assembly's powers that are actually mentioned in the guidance document have not, or tools that can be utilized by the General Assembly. They haven't been utilized in many, many years. And, I think I have a probably, better than a lay person's understanding of the history and purpose of the General Assembly. And there were things in there I had no idea about in terms of that history and the things that the General Assembly had done. So why have these tools not been utilized in such a long time?
So the first thing I would say in answer to this question is that I think those who are best placed to answer the question are those who are actually engaged in all of the discussions, the behind the scenes discussions in and around the General Assembly, which is not myself. But what I can say, you mentioned history. History shows very clearly that the General Assembly takes action when the interests of a 2/3 majority of its members align. There was a significant period of time in the history of the General Assembly from the 1960s through to the 1980s, and a lot of the examples in the guidance document draw from this period, when the General Assembly was regularly dealing with issues in relation to which a reliable 2/3 majority of its members, primarily developing countries or the non-aligned movement, had broadly similar views. The issues were primarily self-determination and decolonization and the defeat of racism and apartheid. And it was in this period and in relation to these issues that we saw the General Assembly passing resolutions which, for example, made scathing critiques of the Security Council, made very specific targeted recommendations to the Security Council, recommended to states that they impose comprehensive mandatory sanctions, and even went so far, as you mentioned, to effectively suspend South Africa from the UN during the apartheid era by rejecting the credentials of its representatives. The General Assembly has also, over the years, been able to muster strong majorities to pass resolutions in relation to Israel and Palestine, and that's enabled it to, on several occasions, recommend sanctions against Israel, and of course requested advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the legality of the wall in the occupied Palestinian territories. In more recent times, the General Assembly has acted upon some of the powers described in the guidance document when the interests of its members have aligned, but these instances have been more sporadic than we saw in the earlier years. Recent examples of the General Assembly acting on some of the powers described in the document include its establishment of the IIIM for Syria in 2016, resolutions on Syria critiquing the Security Council, resolutions on Syria, and also the DPRK calling upon the Security Council to refer situations to the International Criminal Court, its resolution on Crimea declaring the referendum to secede from Ukraine to be invalid, its resolution according Palestine observer state status in the UN, and even its resolution in 2018 expressing concern regarding alleged genocide in Myanmar. These steps are all a notch below the General Assembly's efforts in relation to self-determination and apartheid in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, but they do highlight the range of things that the General Assembly can do when a 2/3 majority of its members want to see action on an issue in relation to which the Security Council is blocked. I'll just comment on two specific powers mentioned in the guidance document and the issue of why they haven't recently been used. On the issue of the General Assembly's competence to reject the credentials of a member state, it's simply not an issue that arises very often. The General Assembly did on a number of occasions in the 90s act on its powers to reject the credentials of a member state by rejecting the credentials of representatives put forward by military regimes following military coups, and instead recognising the credentials of the deposed democratically elected government. And also on a couple of occasions, it chose to defer its decision on credentials. On the specific issue of requesting special reports from the Security Council, I'm not aware why this hasn't been done other than in the very early years on the specific issue of the admission of new members to the UN. In 2005, the General Assembly passed a resolution inviting the Security Council to periodically submit special reports on issues of international concern. However, that hasn't been done by the Security Council. A number of states have raised this issue in recent years, and it does seem quite an obvious tool available to the General Assembly, and that's why it's one of the first options listed in the guidance document.
Thanks for that, Rebecca. I mean, maybe to go back to you, Karen, I mean, there's a kind of implication in the report. I don't want to put words in your mouth at all, Rebecca, and you can just tell me to stop. But the implication in the report, well, I'll say it for me, is that, you know, with 80 million people around the world currently displaced by persecution, conflict, and atrocities, then the UN Security Council is not doing its job properly. So, you know, why does the UN Security Council fail so often, and how can the UN General Assembly possibly help fill the gap? Don't want to get you in diplomatic trouble, but would be interested in your thoughts.
Sure, thanks. And yeah, just following up on the previous question, I agree with Rebecca that I think it would be very interesting to hear the views of member states, you know, about why the General Assembly, I guess, has perhaps not exercised its powers as frequently as it could, despite the fact that, of course, there are many examples of how it has in recent years. So perhaps that's a follow-up study, Rebecca, that could be done with kind of extensive interviewing and kind of historical, you know, archival research that could be done. But yeah, Simon, to your question, I think, you know, this is always a kind of a difficult one, because I think we all know why the Security Council is not carrying out often its work in the way that, you know, most of us would like to see it do its work. And obviously, I think the main reason is that, you know, we can't ignore the political realities that influence the work of the Council, which often results in disagreements on how to address specific situations, and of course, also situations where atrocities are either already occurring or are imminent. And again, we can't avoid, you know, mentioning the use of the veto power by the 5 permanent members, which limits the Council's ability to take timely and decisive action to protect populations from atrocity crimes. And you've already mentioned, that this is something which is ongoing as we speak. And in this regard, I also want to just note that in previous reports on the responsibility to protect by the Secretary General, he has reiterated calls from a number, and in fact, a very significant number of UN member states and civil society organizations for the permanent members of the Security Council to exercise restraint in their use of the veto in situations that include the commission of atrocity crimes. But yeah, I think often, Security Council paralysis is sometimes used as an excuse to say, well, the Security Council is not doing anything about it, so our hands are tied in some ways. And I think this report really suggests that, in fact, the General Assembly has many, many tools and options available to it to step in when the Council is inactive with regards to preventing atrocities or acting when atrocities are taking place. And Rebecca's already mentioned some of them. I think the report really kind of, very clearly outlines the different options, and also really discusses the potential legal implications of some of them. But I think just to highlight, some of the ways in which these tools could be used, or some of the tools available. The one is that the General Assembly, and I think some people forget this, is that it also has the power to exercise preventive diplomacy. Either directly, or it can also request the Secretary General to exercise his good offices. So I think that is a tool that many states, I think, would be amenable to. Kind of drawing on more coercive measures, and this has already been mentioned as well, the General Assembly can, of course, call on states to impose economic and diplomatic sanctions. And again, as has been mentioned, this, of course, is not compulsory in the way that a Security Council resolution calling for sanctions would be. But still, we've talked about the fact that the General Assembly does have, political weight. And so when it makes a recommendation or it calls on states to impose sanctions, this is taken seriously. And I think the report also is very interesting in that it provides us with a historical overview of, how many states have responded positively or not to General Assembly calls for imposing sanctions, for example. And then in some cases, establishing fact-finding missions, commissions of inquiry, and investigative mechanisms is incredibly important, because we know that accountability is such an essential part of not just responding to atrocities, but preventing atrocities in the long run as well. And so when these mechanisms carry out the work of documenting the evidence and making sure that it is available when it comes to the point where perpetrators are going to be held accountable, this is a really, really important role that this General Assembly can play as well. I think I'll stop there for now. I hope I've answered at least part of your question.
No, you definitely have. And I mean, it's people will have to excuse my South African obsession, but I'm going to blame it on the fact that I'm talking to you, Karen. But, it's interesting, because if you look at the history of the struggle against apartheid, the General Assembly was very much leading the UN response at a time when the Security Council actively avoided the issue, or the permanent members at least. And so I think it was the General Assembly that first mentioned apartheid as a crime against humanity, keeping in mind that it's now part of the Rome Statute of the ICC. It was the General Assembly that first called for an arms embargo. It was the General Assembly that first called for a range of measures. We already touched on the credentials issue. And I think, one thing that Rebecca does really well is shows how, okay, they didn't have any enforcement powers, but they definitely helped shape the international debate and increase pressure on the Security Council. So back to you, Rebecca. In the context of what Karen just said, obviously a lot of people focus on the Uniting for Peace mechanism. And there's been talk about this in relation to Myanmar, in relation to Syria. Can you maybe say something about how useful a tool is Uniting for Peace?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I think this is quite an important question because it is raised on a number of occasions. The first thing I would say about Uniting for Peace is that it's definitely not a necessary course of action. The UN Charter, as we've discussed, is very clear that the General Assembly, on its own initiative, is competent to make recommendations on any matter within the scope of the Charter. and specifically on matters of international peace and security and human rights. I think I mentioned that the UN Charter prevents the General Assembly from making recommendations on matters of international peace and security if the Security Council is also exercising its functions on the same matter. But this has been interpreted to mean that the General Assembly can't make recommendations on matters that the Security Council is also exercising its functions right at the same moment. The fact is that in most of the situations that we're talking about, whether it be Myanmar, Syria, Gaza, Xinjiang, there's little question, in fact, that the Security Council is exercising its functions at all. So the General Assembly doesn't have to wait for a referral from the Security Council in order for it to make recommendations on a matter, just because that same matter happens to formally be on the agenda of the Security Council, in the sense that the Security Council is seized of the matter. In terms of the procedural aspects, the General Assembly's rules of procedure allow it to convene special sessions. Special sessions can be requested either by a majority of the General Assembly or by the Security Council. So the Uniting for Peace resolution, or the Uniting for Peace procedure, as it's sometimes called, doesn't provide a procedural mechanism for the General Assembly to meet that doesn't already exist in the Charter, except by introducing the concept of emergency special sessions. Uniting for Peace is most often raised in relation to the use of force. The question of what exactly the General Assembly can do in relation to the use of force is controversial, but the most widely held view is that the General Assembly can recommend the use of force, but that it can't authorise the use of force that would otherwise be unlawful. That basic position regarding what the General Assembly can and can't do doesn't change depending on whether a matter is referred to the General Assembly by the Security Council with explicit reference to the Uniting for Peace resolution. What we say in the guidance document regarding Uniting for Peace is that it may, in some circumstances, serve a political purpose. So in circumstances in which the General Assembly feels that the Security Council is failing to respond to credible reports of atrocities, then convening an emergency special session and passing a resolution explicitly referencing the Uniting for Peace resolution can help the General Assembly to convey its assessment of the gravity of a situation and the Security Council's failure to address it. Similarly, in situations in which a concerned majority of the Security Council feels frustrated that the Security Council is unable to act on a particular situation, as is often the case, passing a procedural resolution invoking the Uniting for Peace resolution and referring the matter to the General Assembly is a way for that concerned majority of the Security Council to express its concern and its view that the Security Council is failing to fulfil its responsibilities for the maintenance of international peace and security. A referral from the Security Council can also feasibly increase the political legitimacy of any recommendation subsequently made by the General Assembly by preemptively rebutting possible critiques of the Security Council for encroaching upon what some may still regard as the exclusive remit of the Security Council.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I mean, interesting points. And I remember when Jan Eliasson was Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, you know, anybody who had the privilege of working with him will know this. He used to carry a copy of the UN Charter inside his coat pocket. And I've literally been in both dinners and meetings where somebody would say something about the UN Charter and he would pull out his charter and flip to the page and say, no, you're wrong. Here's why you're wrong. You know, here's what the charter says. So my only regret about this document is that I can't fit it, you know, in a jacket pocket, because I've heard those discussions so many times around Uniting for Peace and so forth. And I would love to be able to kind of like pull this out and go, no, 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 no. The guidance document says very clearly, and the ICJ found, and this is blah, 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 and this is how it can actually happen. And it just hasn't been utilized in a long time. Sorry, when I'm looking away, it's because I'm actually, Jahan, who's running this whole meeting and is the puppet master here, is sending me also questions through from the audience. So let me just go to one of those questions. This is from Leah Owen, who says, how might the General Assembly be protected or insulated from major powers obstructing its work? or from instrumentalizing it to their own purposes. We've seen this with the ICC and ICJ, as well as threats to withdraw funding to UN agencies over Israel-Palestine. If this comes to a confrontation between major powers and the rest, what can help protect the General Assembly's ability to act in these challenging situations? So I don't know if either of you wants to have a stab at that. Both of you.
I can try, Simon. I'm not sure if I have an answer. Maybe Rebecca has a better answer to this in terms of the actual evidence that's available, or maybe there's a legal answer to it. But yeah, again, I think, this brings us into the realm of politics. And so while, I think obviously we can, as you said, turn to the charter, turn to legal precedent to say, well, this is what is possible. This is what the General Assembly can do. I think when it comes to a question of, what can it do in practice, given the politics within a body that consists of 193 member states, we're getting into kind of a different discussion. And I think this is what Leah's question kind of points to. And so I'm not sure if there's a specific kind of mechanism available to, as she says, protect the General Assembly from kind of undue influence by major powers. I mean, I think there's also, there's strength in numbers. I think that would be my one answer. If we look at, again, the kind of history of decision-making in the General Assembly. I mean, I always say this to my students when they learn about realism in international relations, and they say, well, doesn't that just mean that the powerful states always get their way? And I say, well, no, if we look at history, there are certain things that happened and certain resolutions that were passed in the General Assembly that were clearly not in the interests of the major powers. If we look at the whole process of decolonization, for example, which was again driven by, as Rebecca said earlier, a certain group of states from the global south, when there was still unity in the global south, which perhaps today is lacking to some extent. So, I think that's part of the answer, that I think when there's strength in numbers, then it's more difficult to undermine a strong position. But it also takes me back to what Rebecca said right at the beginning. The General Assembly can be very constructive and it can act, but that means that a 2/3 majority really has to support the action. And of course, we know that states have interests, they have allies, and that all of this is taken into account when they debate issues, they decide whether or not to move forward with issues in the General Assembly. So yeah, that's my very long-winded and not very specific answer to that question. So I'm hoping that Rebecca can point to somewhere in the charter that gives us an answer to this. So
I can make a few points. The first, definitely I cannot point to somewhere in the charter that gives an answer to it, and there's no legal answer, and there's really no simple answer at all. The points I will make, firstly, regarding the guidance document itself, is that the guidance document, I think Ambassador Simonovic said this at the start, it's a resource for states. It's a menu of options. It doesn't sort of presuppose to make assumptions about the political realities of what is and is not possible. It says, here are the options, diplomats, it's now on you to work out what is possible of the menu of options that is there. So that's the thing to say about the guidance document. The second thing to say is that I think in a number of situations, and I think Syria and Myanmar are obvious examples, looking through the General Assembly debates, it is very evident that there is more than a 2/3 majority of member states that are very concerned by the situation, are horrified by the atrocity crimes that are being committed in Syria and Myanmar in particular, are very dismayed by the lack of action that they're seeing in the Security Council, and want to see the international community generally, the UN system, respond more effectively than it is currently managing to respond. So you're not necessarily going to get consensus, and you're not necessarily going to overcome the difficulties that this question is alluding to. But I think this document kind of takes as its starting point the fact that there is evidence from debates that states do want to do more to respond to atrocities. And the last point that I wanted to make, and I think this has come up recently in regards to the Myanmar resolution that was recently being, and hopefully is still being considered by the General Assembly, is that consensus should not be considered at all costs. I was recently rereading the remarks that Kofi Annan made, that consensus is becoming an end in itself in the General Assembly and is resulting in sort of lowest common denominator resolutions that don't achieve anything at all. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that consensus is not a requirement for General Assembly resolutions. No state has the right of veto. So it's not something that should be sought at the cost of the General Assembly responding to atrocity crimes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really important point, and it's one that anybody who's had the misfortune of hearing me speak publicly will have heard me make those points again and again and again, not only in relation to the General Assembly, but in relation to the Security Council. There was a consensus that results in turning a blind eye to genocide in a part of the world is not a consensus that is in any sense positive. Consensus around inaction and indifference to the suffering of human beings runs counter to the Charter of the United Nations. There's some other questions here, and I'm going to attempt to kind of consolidate them into one kind of question about Geneva, I guess, basically, which is, it's very interesting. You're kind of saying, okay, the Security Council has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, but that doesn't mean the General Assembly is out of the equation. It just says the primary responsibility rests here. And then the reverse is true when it comes to human rights, of course, that the General Assembly has the primary responsibility for those issues. And there's also if I can shift metaphors for a moment, there's a kind of Venn diagram when it comes to mass atrocities where these issues clearly overlap: international peace and security and human rights. So this is where I'm going to try and consolidate. So given that the Human Rights Council in Geneva is a relatively new institution, and most of what you're talking about in relation to the GA precedes the creation of the HRC in Geneva, are there particular tools that you think would be useful in terms of kind of trying to maximize the power and the influence of the HRC on some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think some things fall more logically within the remit of the Human Rights Council, and some fall more logically within the remit of the General Assembly. I think a lot of the what the guidance document talks about in relation to commissions of inquiry and fact finding do predate the Human Rights Council, and so that sort of package of tools that are available to the General Assembly is probably, with now and into the future, will more commonly fall within the Human Rights Council. But it's not to say that for various reasons the General Assembly can't do it if it sees fit and if circumstances require in a particular situation, such as the IIIM for Syria, for example. But quite a number of the tools in the guidance document are actually not available to the Human Rights Council, and will not be as powerful necessarily coming from the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council can't, for example, request special reports from the Security Council. The Human Rights Council can make recommendations to the Security Council in just the same way that the General Assembly can do, but I would suspect that they're not necessarily, probably not as powerful or influential or persuasive as recommendations coming from the General Assembly. With regards to recommendations for sanctions, I think they would be more powerful coming. The Human Rights Council can make recommendations to states for sanctions, just in the same way that the General Assembly can, but I would think that recommendations from the General Assembly would carry greater political weight. There's a couple of other specific tools in there that are not available to the Human Rights Council, such as requesting advisory opinions from the International Court of Justice, for example, or the issue of credentials is obviously something that is specifically available to the General Assembly.
No, and Karen, you're welcome to comment on this as well, but I'm just looking at the time now, and I want to make sure we leave enough time for the Permanent Representative of Australia, who's got some comments. But let me kind of maybe ask you a final question, Karen, and again, you're welcome to comment on what Rebecca just mentioned as well. But as was mentioned in the opening of Croatia's ambassador to the UN, last month, the General Assembly adopted a landmark resolution on the responsibility to protect. Are you sort of optimistic that this will prompt the General Assembly to more seriously consider what steps it might take in relation to the meaningful prevention of atrocity crimes in the world, using and utilizing some of the tools and procedures that have been outlined in this wonderful guidance document?
Well, yeah, maybe I'll just say just one thing about the previous question. I just want to again emphasize that, you know, as the guidance document emphasizes as well, that this is really about complementarity, right? So we're not saying that the General Assembly should be doing anything that, you know, and kind of take over the work of the Human Rights Council or vice versa, or of this Security Council. I think it's about complementarity, but I think it also speaks to, you know, greater collaboration. And we often have this discussion as well about the, you know, the so-called New York, Geneva kind of division, or the rift with peace and security on the one hand and human rights in Geneva. And I think it's also really about, you know, the two, or not just these two parts of the UN, but all the different parts of the UN kind of work together when it comes to thinking about how best to prevent and address atrocity crimes. Because again, time and time again, we've seen, you know, effective atrocity prevention in particular really requires a kind of comprehensive response. And so it's really about, you know, not saying that this body has the primary responsibility here. It's really about thinking what are the strengths of the different parts of the UN, and of course working in collaboration with member states, regional organizations, and civil society, and you know, all just putting our heads together and thinking about how best to do this. And I think that's exactly what the guidance document suggests. It's saying, well, these are maybe things that this General Assembly could do in addition to what it's already doing, in addition to what others are doing. And I think that makes it very valuable. But sorry, I'm taking up too much time. I'll move to the question that you've asked me. And yeah, I think it's of course it was, you know, we're very happy that this resolution was passed. And just for those of you, for those maybe audience members who don't know, it essentially does two things. Firstly, it places the responsibility to protect as a standing agenda item on the General Assembly. And I think this is significant in that it institutionalizes the importance of the responsibility to protect, and it provides a formal annual opportunity for states to consider options to strengthen their collective capacity to prevent and respond to atrocity crimes. And I'm hoping that in future this will include, you know, using this guidance document in considering these options. And secondly, it asks the Secretary General to report annually on the responsibility to protect, which provides a way of assessing the degree of implementation of recommendations included in past reports of the Secretary General on the subject. But I think in the end, the form that the debate takes and the issues that are discussed really depends on member states. And that's why it's so important to have the support of member states such as Croatia and Australia, and also others who are not perhaps present here today. Because while in the past, the informal and formal debates have consisted mainly of really general statements of commitments or you know, raising of concern about particular elements of the principle, I think there's great potential for this debate to become one in which states can consider the role of the General Assembly in preventing and responding to atrocity crimes. And I want to add that an important part of advancing the development of the responsibility to protect is considering the range of options available to different actors in fulfilling their responsibility, including the General Assembly. And as I just said in response to the previous question, we know that effective prevention is multifaceted, and it involves, out of necessity, a multitude of actors. And also just, you know, in addition, states have obligations under existing international law to prevent and respond to atrocity crimes, such as genocide. And so they must use all tools available to them to meet these obligations. And so maybe just as a final word, I really hope that this report has been or will be sent to all member states, and that they will use the opportunity to reflect on how they can make better use of the General Assembly to better protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you, Karen, and I certainly echo your comments, not least of all regarding the role that Croatia and Australia have played in advancing the responsibility to protect at the UN General Assembly. And I think, I'd really underline your point, because I think any of us who, work with the UN around these kinds of issues hear all the time the kind of phrase about prevention, prevention, prevention. But this document in a really dramatic way kind of says, okay, what kind of prevention are you actually doing, outside of rhetorical statements? Are you actually trying to advance these tools and utilize them to actually prevent atrocities in a very meaningful way? Let me thank both of you, Karen and Rebecca, for your remarks today. I'm sure the audience found the discussion as insightful as I did, and I hope today's conversation inspires the UN membership and civil society to go out, get this document. It's available on our website. I'm sure it's available on the Asia Pacific website as well. Not only read the report, but act on its recommendations. And it's now my pleasure to give the floor to our other co-host and another great friend, His Excellency, Mr. Mitchell Fifield, Permanent Representative of Australia to the United Nations, to close the event for today.
Well, thank you so much, Simon, and colleagues. Just what an absolutely fabulous forum this has been this morning. Can I firstly thank so much the President of the General Assembly for taking the time to share his message with us. And my good friend and colleague, Ambassador Ivan, who really is the thought leader on these issues amongst the community of permanent representatives here in New York. So great to be part of this with you, and to our panel, Simon, who's always wonderful, Karen and Rebecca. Can I just say what an absolute tour de force of the issues you've provided for us today, and just very pleased to be here on behalf of the Australian government as a co-host for this event. For our part, Australia has a long history in the development of the R2P norm. In fact, it's 20 years since the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, co-chaired by former Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, released its groundbreaking R2P report. Sadly, as we've discussed this morning, in the decades since then, it's really demonstrated that we do need to do more to prevent atrocity crimes, more to uphold the principle that sovereignty comes with responsibility. We can't say that too often. Colleagues, we also have COVID, which has exacerbated vulnerabilities. It's increased the risk factors that can lead to mass atrocities. So we can't become complacent, and none of us on this call are. And that's why events like today are just so important, so crucial to advance our understanding of the some words, there are some moments, I'll give up.
Operationalization.
Thank you. Some words, just when you pause on them, you don't have a hope. Anyway, we want to operationalise the R2P norm. So this has been fantastic, and our panel have reminded us of key priorities for the ongoing promotion of R2P, and I just jotted down a few that our colleagues on the panel have reminded us of the gap between our collective determination to do more to protect populations from the most egregious crimes and the reality of rising violence and atrocities today. The discussion has challenged us to consider some controversial ideas about what the GA could do to complement Security Council action or inaction. These aren't easy issues by any means, and also, as we've heard today, what we do here will inevitably be shaped by the political realities within which we operate. But what's been really clear from our discussion is that while we should continue to urge the Security Council to bring atrocity situations under consideration as soon as possible. There's also a role for the GA to play, and more can be done to better understand the tools and the powers that are available. And to that end, today we particularly commend Rebecca and the Asia Pacific Centre for R2P for their efforts in developing this guidance document. It is a valuable addition to the toolkit that's available to the international community to meet the ongoing challenges of preventing and responding to mass atrocities. And Australia's been a proud partner of the Asia Pacific Centre for R2P since it was established more than 10 years ago. As the only non-government organisation focused specifically on the implementation of R2P in the Asia Pacific region, it's important. I also wish to thank the Global Centre for R2P, Simon, for organising today's event. Non-government partners like the Global Centre and the Asia Pacific Centre, along with the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and R2P, really are a centrepiece of our national, our regional and our international implementation of R2P norm. They really do help to underpin our collective advocacy for prevention and accountability across the multilateral system. And it does need to be acknowledged that they do provide credible information to alert the international community of situations of risk. They build our capacity in developing early warning mechanisms and baseline assessments, strengthening national human rights institutions, and identifying upstream drivers of atrocity crimes, and so much more beyond that. Looking ahead, particular thanks to Ambassador Ivan and his team. We will now see R2P added to the UN General Assembly's annual agenda and formally mandated R2P reports delivered by the UN Secretary General. This has been a personal passion of Ivan, so congratulations, mate, to you and your team. This is an important evolution of the R2P dialogue and its status in the UN system. But we know that the work goes on and that we need to and will continue to work closely with our non-government partners, with the group of friends, R2P focal points, the Office of the Special Advisors and others to ensure that the General Assembly debates move the conversation forward on the conceptualisation and the operationalisation of the R2P norm. Finally, can I thank everyone who's joined us for today. More than 150 people have tuned in, which is sensational. And I've got to say, I am really buoyed by today's demonstration of the might of the global will to do better to protect populations from mass atrocities. So it's been a great session. Thank you all, and we will continue the conversation. Cheers.